He was standing in our bedroom doorway in a pressed Oxford shirt and dark jeans, smelling like the cedar cologne I'd given him for Christmas, and I was sitting on the edge of our bed with a heating pad against my abdomen, 4 days post-surgery, trying to remember how to breathe without it hurting. "You look good," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. He smiled. Not at me, really, more like past me. "My brother booked that cabin in Whistler months ago," he said. "You know that. I can't just cancel." I did know. I'd known since January, but that was before February, before the surgeons sat us both down and drew diagrams on a whiteboard about what was happening inside my body, before the words ovarian torsion became part of my vocabulary, before I spent 6 hours in the OR and 3 days in St. Paul's with tubes in my arm. That was before all of it. "I'll be fine," I said, which was not true at all. He kissed the top of my head. He wheeled his carry-on out the front door. And then I heard his car, my car actually, the Subaru I'd owned since before we met, that I'd put in both our names because that's what you do, that's what trust looks like, backing out of the driveway. I sat there in the silence of our condo for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and I called my dad. "My name is Margot. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Vancouver in a house in Kitsilano 3 blocks from the beach, in a family that was never flashy but was always solid. My dad, Gordon, spent 30 years as a civil litigator. My mom taught grade 4 at the same elementary school for 26 years. We were wealthy in the way people throw that word around. We were comfortable, which in Vancouver means something specific. You own, you don't rent, you don't panic when the furnace breaks down. My parents had worked for every inch of what they had. I met my husband at a work event. He was charming in that effortless way that makes you feel chosen. Like something about you specifically drew him to you out of all the people in the room. He worked in project management for a mid-size construction firm. He made decent money. He was funny. He remembered things. Your coffee order, the name of your childhood dog, the aunt you'd mentioned once in passing. I thought that was love. I know now it was something else. We got married 3 years ago at a vineyard in the Okanagan. 40 guests, a long dinner, dancing until the staff started stacking chairs around us. My dad cried during his speech. I have a photo of that moment on my phone, and sometimes I look at it and feel a complicated grief I don't have a name for yet. The first year was fine. The second year, I started noticing things. The way he deflected when I asked about money. The way he'd get quiet and cold when I pushed back on anything. The way he'd find small ways to make me feel like my concerns were the problem and not the thing I was concerned about. But every time I got close to naming what I was feeling, something would happen. A good weekend, a thoughtful gesture, a conversation that felt like old times. And I'd tell myself I was reading too much into it. Then I got sick. I'd been having pain for months. I kept dismissing it. I was busy. I work as a financial analyst at a benefits firm downtown, and that winter was brutal for our team. By the time I finally went to the doctor and then to the specialist, it was urgent. The surgeon explained it to us together in her office, my husband and I sitting side by side, and I reached for his hand and he gave it to me. He held it the whole appointment. He did all the right things at the hospital, brought me the good pillow from home, sat with me through the pre-op, told the nurses I was allergic to latex, which I'd mentioned exactly once, 8 months earlier. And then, 72 hours after my surgery, he left for Whistler. When I called my dad that evening, I didn't cry right away. I described the situation factually, the way he'd taught me to. What happened, in what order. He listened without interrupting, which is his great talent and the thing I've always loved most about him. When I finished, there was a pause. "Are you in pain right now?" he asked. "Yes." "Is there food in the apartment?" "Some." "I'll be there in 40 minutes, he said. He showed up with soup from the place on Broadway I'd been going to since I was a teenager, and a bag that had clearly been packed in a hurry. He'd grabbed the wrong reading glasses. His socks didn't match, and he sat with me at the kitchen table while I ate. And he didn't say anything dramatic or declarative. He just kept filling my water glass. It was my mom who got it out of me. She arrived the next morning, and within an hour I was telling her things I hadn't said out loud yet. Not just about the Whistler trip, but about the 2 years before it. The coldness, the deflection, the way I'd started editing myself in my own home, choosing my words carefully before I spoke, bracing for the particular silence that meant I'd said the wrong thing. She sat across from me at the table and listened, and then she said, quietly, "Margot, how long have you been doing that?" I didn't have a good answer. My dad came back into the kitchen. He'd been on the phone in the other room. He sat down and looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Do you have access to all your financial accounts, all of them?" I said I thought so. He said, "When did you last actually log in and look?" I want to say I was surprised by what we found. I want to say it came out of nowhere. But somewhere in the part of me that had been quietly keeping score for 2 years, I think I already knew something was wrong. I just hadn't been willing to look at it directly. My husband and I had a joint checking account that we used for household expenses, mortgage, groceries, utilities. We also each had our own accounts. That had been my idea, actually. Something my dad suggested when we got engaged. Keep a shared account for shared life. Keep your own money your own. What I hadn't known was that my husband had also opened a second account, in my name. I found out because my dad, who has spent his career reading financial disclosures and smelling the particular smell of money moving in directions it shouldn't, asked me to pull up my credit report. I'd never thought to check it. We had good credit. Everything felt fine. Why would I look? There it was. An account at a different institution opened 14 months earlier. A line of credit, $46,000 drawn against it. I sat very still. I could hear my mom in the other room, on the phone with her sister, laughing at something. My dad read the screen and then he read it again. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called someone named Alistair, who I would later learn was a former colleague who now ran a white-collar fraud practice in downtown Vancouver. I listened to half a conversation. My dad's voice was even and professional and completely terrifying in its calmness. When he hung up, he looked at me and said, "Here's what I know so far. Someone used your information to open that account. That is either identity theft by a stranger, which is possible, or it was done by someone with access to your SIN, your banking credentials, and your mail, which narrows it considerably." "He manages our finances," I said. "I know," my dad said. My husband came back from Whistler on a Sunday afternoon, tan and relaxed, with a gift bag from a local distillery. He set it on the counter and started talking about the drive back, traffic on the Coquihalla, whether we should get a ski pass next year. I was sitting at the kitchen table. My dad was sitting across from me. Alistair was standing near the window. My husband stopped talking. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head for 3 days. I'd imagined being cold, or composed, or righteous. What I actually felt was exhausted in a way that went all the way down to the bone. 4 days out of surgery, a heating pad still on the kitchen chair beside me, looking at the man I'd married and trying to locate the version of him I'd thought he was. "Sit down," my dad said. He didn't raise his voice. He never raises his voice. My husband looked at him, looked at me. He sat. Alistair began. "The account. The 46,000. The forged signature on the application. My signature. Checked against documents I'd actually signed. The pattern of transfers. The 6 months of charges that corresponded almost exactly with expenditures my husband had made that he'd told me were work expenses. This is identity fraud under the criminal code," Alistair said. "I've already been in contact with the relevant institution. I've also been in contact with your employer's HR department, since several of these transactions occurred during business hours from a device registered to your firm." My husband's face did a thing I'd never seen it do before. Something underneath it collapsed. "Margot," he said, looking at me, I can explain. You can explain it to the institutions involved, Alistair said pleasantly. Not here. There's a version of the story where I second-guessed myself, where I thought about the good years, the vineyard in the Okanagan, my dad crying during his speech, where I wondered if I was overreacting. I did think about those things. I thought about them at 3 in the morning, lying in our bed alone, listening to the city outside. But I also thought about the morning after my surgery, coming out of the anesthetic fog, reaching for my phone to text him that I was awake, and the 2 hours before he replied. I thought about the way he'd stood in the doorway in his Oxford shirt, smelling like cedar, and told me he'd be fine. Not that I'd be fine, that he'd be fine. I thought about my mom asking how long I'd been editing myself in my own home. I thought about not having a good answer. The process was not fast, and it was not simple. That's the honest version. Alistair filed the fraud complaint with the financial institution and flagged it with the appropriate authorities. My dad's firm, he brought in a family law associate, sent a separation agreement within the week. The joint account was frozen pending review. The Subaru, which was registered in my name and had been for 6 years before I added him to it, was returned to the parkade without drama because Alistair had sent a very specific letter to my husband's temporary address, a friend's couch in East Van, apparently, that made the situation clear. My husband retained a lawyer. There were calls and countercalls and a period of about 6 weeks where I felt like I was living inside a spreadsheet. My dad came over every Thursday. My mom sent food. Real food. The kind that requires actual cooking, which is her love language in its clearest form. My friend Sloane, who I've known since grade 7, slept on my couch for 2 weeks and watched British murder mysteries with me every night until I could fall asleep without the television on. In the end, here's what happened. The financial institution confirmed the fraud. The line of credit was dissolved and the liability transferred. My husband signed the separation agreement in exchange for a reduced timeline on the fraud investigation, a deal his lawyer negotiated and that I agreed to because I wanted it over, not because I thought he deserved it. The divorce was filed in BC Supreme Court. We had no children. We had the condo, which had been purchased with a down payment that came from my parents' gift and my own savings, and which Alistair and the family law associate made very short work of establishing as mine. He walked away with his car, his tools, his record collection, and a debt to the financial institution that he would be paying for a long time. I walked away with my life back. I'm not going to tell you I felt triumphant. That's not what it felt like. It felt like grief, mostly. The slow, bewildering grief of losing a future you'd planned on, of looking back at 3 years and rearranging what you thought they meant. There were days I was furious. Days I was just sad. Days I looked at that photo of my dad crying at our wedding and felt a loss I couldn't quite articulate. But here's what I kept coming back to. He left. 4 days after my surgery, in my car, to go skiing. He left, and he didn't call for 18 hours. And when I asked him why, he said he figured I was resting. A person who loves you doesn't figure you're resting. A person who loves you picks up the phone. My dad drove 40 minutes in evening traffic with mismatched socks and the wrong glasses because I called him. That's what love looks like. Not grand gestures and cedar cologne and remembering the name of your childhood dog. Showing up. Being the person who actually comes when you call. I'm writing this almost a year later. I still live in the condo. I painted the bedroom in October, a deep blue-green that I love that he would have hated. I went back to work in the spring and it felt like putting on a coat that fit right. Sloane and I have a standing Sunday brunch now. I'm 3 sessions into therapy and my therapist has the excellent quality of being very smart and not letting me get away with anything. My dad and I have dinner on the first Friday of every month. We've done that since I was in university. I used to think of it as an obligation. A sweet one, but an obligation. The kind of thing you do because family does it. Now I sit across from him at that table and feel something I can only describe as clarity. He didn't save me. I want to be careful about that. I had the presence of mind to make the call, and I made it because some part of me already knew, already understood that something was very wrong and that I had people in my corner who would help me see it clearly. He was one of those people. He happened to be the one I called first. But I do think about that moment. The empty apartment, the sound of the Subaru reversing down the driveway, the silence, and how easy it would have been to just sit with it, to tell myself I was overreacting, to wait for him to come back and believe whatever he told me. I didn't do that. I'm proud of that. I picked up the phone. I called my dad, and slowly, carefully, with a lot of help and a lot of Thursday evenings and a lot of bad television on a friend's couch, I found my way back to myself. That's the part nobody tells you about. Not the fraud, not the lawyers, not the account with my name on it that I never opened. The part nobody tells you is that the hardest thing isn't finding out the truth. The hardest thing is deciding you deserve to know it. I did. I do. And I'm not editing myself anymore. I keep coming back to the moment I heard the Subaru back out of the driveway. That sound. The way it just faded. 4 days out of surgery, heating pad on my lap, and the apartment went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. I've thought about what made that moment the one that finally broke through. Not the coldness over 2 years. Not the deflection, the small erasures, the way I'd started choosing my words carefully in my own home. It was the sound of him leaving, and the silence after. There's something I've come to understand about the choices we make when we're at our most exhausted and most honest. They tend to be the right ones. When I picked up that phone and called my dad, I wasn't being strategic. I wasn't thinking about lawyers or accounts or what came next. I was just telling the truth to someone I knew would hear it without flinching. That honesty, as simple and unglamorous as it was, turned out to be the hinge everything else swung on. My dad used to tell me when I was a teenager and furious about something that being smart wasn't enough on its own. You had to be willing to look at things clearly, even the things you'd rather not see. I think I finally understood what he meant when I sat in front of that credit report and made myself read every line. It would have been so easy to close the laptop, to tell myself there was probably an explanation. I didn't do that. I looked. And then I made a decision from what I actually knew, not from what I hoped was true. That's what I think about now when I'm tempted to soften the story, to say it wasn't that bad, or I might have read it wrong, or people make mistakes. Maybe. But I also know that a person who genuinely loves you does not turn their phone off for 18 hours while you recover from surgery. And I know that I spent 2 years making myself smaller so that someone else could feel comfortable, and that shrinking didn't make me safer or more loved. It just made me smaller. Getting back to myself wasn't fast or neat. There were weeks where I cried in the shower and ate cereal for dinner and rewatched the same British mystery series until I had the plots memorized. There were nights where I grieved the future I'd planned on. The vineyard, the dancing, my dad's face during his speech, and let myself feel how much it hurt without rushing to the part where I was fine. But I also kept getting up. I went back to work. I called Sloan. I sat across from my therapist and said the hard things out loud instead of managing them quietly inside. And slowly, over months, I found that the life I was building alone felt more like me than anything I'd had in years. What my husband did had consequences. Real, legal, lasting ones. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because actions accumulate. Every choice he made, from the account opened in my name to the ski bag packed while I was still on pain medication, added up to something he eventually had to face. That's not fate. That's just cause and effect, playing out the way it always does eventually. And every choice I made, to look clearly, to ask for help, to stop editing myself, added up too. Into this. Into a bedroom painted the color I actually wanted. Into a Sunday brunch that never gets canceled. Into a life that is quieter and smaller in some ways, and so much more mine. I didn't know, when I made that call, that it would change everything. I just knew I was done being alone in a full room. Turns out that was enough to start.